How do you handle an army mutiny? By having a massive party, of course. At least that's how you do things if you were Alexander the Great. In this video, we're going to take a deep dive into the Banquet at Opis and explore what it tells us about why historians interpret things the way that they do and why they so often disagree with one another. Opis was a city in Babylonia, not that far from modern-day Baghdad in Iraq. In 324, when Alexander was in the city, his Macedonian army mutinied. Now, I won't go into too many details about that right now, but essentially to put down this mutiny, Alexander promoted a load of Persians to high-ranking positions, and this forced the Macedonians to come and beg him for forgiveness. He then held a banquet to celebrate, which is known sometimes by historians as the Banquet of Reconciliation. This banquet became really controversial in the 20th century because it was used as the key piece of evidence by a historian called William Woodthorpe Tarn as part of his argument that Alexander wanted to create a universal brotherhood of mankind. But before we get to him, let's look at what the ancient evidence says. Our main source for this event is the Roman historian Arrian, and I'm going to give you what he says in Greek. Euxeto deta te ala kai te agatha kai homonoion te kai koinonian tes arches makedosi kai persais. Don't worry too much about my pronunciation. My accent does not match well with ancient Greek. Let's forget about that. Let's just talk about what it means. Euxeto, he prayed, for tate ala kai te agatha. Essentially, good things. So this is all quite generic, and then we get to the important bit because Alexander is said to have prayed for homonoian, so just concord, so essentially kind of peace and friendship, and koinonian tes arches, so partnership in empire, Makedosi kai persais, so Macedonians and Persians. Then there's these two tiny words, te and kai. When they're structured like this usually means that the concepts they're talking about are linked together. So we can read this as Alexander praying for concord between Macedonians and Persians, as well as partnership in empire between Macedonians and Persians. Now that obviously sounds really wordy when you translate things into English, so I'd usually translate it as something like Alexander prayed for some good things, as well as concord and partnership in empire between the Macedonians and the Persians. Tarn acknowledged that the translation I've just given was valid, but he preferred an alternative. So he suggested that Alexander prayed for the other good things and for homonoia and for partnership in the realm between Macedonians and Persians. What he's doing here is making homonoia, concord, stand alone as something real in its own right. Rather than saying that Alexander prayed for peace between the Macedonians and the Persians, Tarn is saying simply that Alexander prayed for peace. This gives it a generalizing, universalizing quality. And so what Tarn's saying here is that Alexander was praying for world peace. Given what we know about Alexander's bloody campaigns of conquest, this seems quite far-fetched, right? So to understand why Tarn was making this argument, we need to dig a little deeper into his background. Tarn was born in 1869 into a well-off family and he died in 1957. He was educated first at Eton and then at Trinity College, Cambridge. After university, he became a barrister, but he retired in 1905 due to ill health. He moved to Scotland and established himself as an independent scholar. During the First World War, he worked in intelligence and then he returned to academia. So in lots of ways, Tarn was typical of the late Victorian and Edwardian elite. And we get a sense from his writing that he saw Alexander's empire as a force for good, much as lots of his contemporaries would present the British Empire as being a good thing with a civilizing mission rooted in Christianity. But of course, Tarn was also part of that generation who were horrified by the casualties of World War I and who promised never again. Tarn's most influential thinking on Alexander was done in the 1920s. Right when the League of Nations, the forerunner to today's UN, was trying to assert itself and was trying to bring nations together in new ways. So when Tarn creates this picture of people from all over the world dining with Alexander, sharing food and drink at his table, I think you can see the influence of the world around him on his scholarship. What's most fascinating though is that Tarn's biography of Alexander wasn't actually published until 1948, and I find the passage in that book about the banquet at Opis incredibly moving. He talks about how Alexander's idea of a worldwide commonwealth had inspired the ancient philosopher Zeno, had influenced early Christian tradition, and had run right through into the modern world and affected the ideals of the French Revolution. Then he adds this footnote. And this is just such a despondent note to write that I think we get the sense here of a man who has had his heart broken and his worldview shattered completely by the horrors of World War II. Now, if Tarn couldn't come to terms with the Second World War, the man who ultimately demolished his arguments about Alexander was somebody who couldn't escape the shadow of that war. His name was Ernst Badian. Badian was an Austrian Jew who was born in Vienna in 1925. His father was attacked on Kristallnacht and briefly interned in Dachau, but the family was able to escape to New Zealand in 1939. He eventually studied at Oxford, taught at a few universities in the UK, and then moved to the US and spent most of his career at Harvard. Badian had a really long scholarly career and he was still publishing in the 2000s. Now, one article that I find fascinating from this period is about conspiracies. Badian essentially argues that Alexander saw conspiracies everywhere because he himself was constantly conspiring against the people around him to increase his own power. In this article, he says, those of us who've lived through the age of Hitler and Stalin will find plenty of examples of this. And that just shows you how the tyrants of the mid-20th century, who had so profoundly shaped the world in which he grew up, continued to affect his thinking about Alexander decades later. Badian's view of Alexander is probably best summarised in an article published in 1962 called Alexander the Great and the Loneliness of Power. He talks about Alexander as somebody who had conquered the world only to lose his soul, somebody who had fought and fought and fought to increase his own power, only to end up being completely and utterly alone. His cynical, paranoid Alexander is completely at odds with Tarn's universal dreamer, and his takedown of Tarn's argument is so brutal, I'm going to read it. Mistranslation in the crucial passage, misdirection in its setting, free imaginative interpretation where its restrictions and precision are irksome, and vague use of words charged with emotion. Those so far have turned out to be the methods by which the image of Alexander, the universal philosopher, is built up. Pretty damning, right? But his main criticism is the way that Tarn ignores the tek-kai construction that I mentioned earlier so that he can make homonoia, concord, this universal thing. So I agree with Badian here, and I've got another bone to pick with Tarn as well. Now, this is how Tarn invites us to imagine the scene at Opis. And what I'm particularly interested in is the way he asks us to picture all of these people from all over the world sitting at Alexander's table. Because when we look at Arrian's text, I don't think that's what he says. Arrian starts off by saying, Alexandros kathemenos te autos. Essentially, Alexander himself sat down. Then he says, Panton kathemenon amph auton men Macedonon. He's talking now about all of the Macedonians sitting down, but the key words are amph auton, which mean around him, around Alexander. Then Arrian says, Endetoi effexes touton person, and next to them, the Persians. And then, epi de tutois ton alon ethnon hosoi kat axiosin hertina alen areten presbionimenoi. And then essentially anybody else who deserved to be seated because of some virtue or because of their standing. Tarn has this as a cosmopolitan, egalitarian setting with everybody sat at Alexander's table. But I think that actually Arrian's text suggests that this is much more hierarchical, especially if we read it literally, because he has Alexander sit down, and then he has the Macedonians sit amph auton, around him, endetoi effexes, next to them, the Persians, epi de tutois, and then everybody else. I think the seating arrangements here are telling us what Alexander thought of the hierarchy of the peoples in his empire. He was sitting in the center of the room, just like he was at the center of the empire. The Macedonians are the people who are closest to him. Then the Persians, they're the next rank. And then you get everybody else. This really matters given the timing of the banquet. A few days earlier, the Macedonians had mutinied. Part of the reason for their mutiny was supposedly that they were worried that they were losing status to the Persians. This was the perfect way to remind them of their importance. But to combat the mutiny, Alexander had promised the Persians special honours. He couldn't backtrack from that so quickly, so this was a way to show them that they were indeed important to him. Now, there is some of Tarn's equality of peoples or equality of nations or cosmopolitanism in the scene, but as I read it, it's only in the outermost circle. There is, I think, also some Persian influence on the way Alexander is setting things out here, but I'll talk about that in another video. The question I do have about this, and I honestly don't have an answer yet, is whether this was a one-off response to a very specific incident, or whether this was how Alexander wanted to represent his empire going forward. So part of this video was about explaining what I think happened at Opis, but I also wanted to use it as an example of why it is ultimately impossible for historians to be entirely objective when they look at the past. For me, one of the reasons that history is so fascinating is that every generation sees the past in new ways because they've experienced the world in different ways. And we've seen a really good example of that with Badian and Tarn. People have been writing about Alexander for thousands of years, right? And so sometimes critics can say quite cynical things like, oh, come on, Alexander again, what can you possibly say that's new? Now to that, I would say that if you think about what's important to you, what your values are, what you think matters, you will inevitably find new questions to ask of Alexander's reign because you will see the past differently to the people who studied this topic before you. But I'd also encourage you to reflect a little bit on what makes you who you are and what experiences have shaped the way you see the world, because that will help you identify your own unconscious biases and the blind spots in your own research, and ultimately that's going to make you a better historian. If you've enjoyed this, please do give the video a like, please do subscribe to the channel, because I'll be back next week with a brand new deep dive into a different aspect of ancient history. So hope to see you there. Thanks for watching.